Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today Will's going to share some knowledge on pruning pear and apple trees and show you some techniques that we use here on the farm that hopefully you can take back home and use on your trees. Hope you enjoy. How are they looking?
Pretty good. Get pruning them. Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in today. So what we're going to be looking at today is how to prune apples and pear trees. And actually you can use the same philosophy in pruning both apples and pear trees because they're actually both pome fruits, P-O-M-E. And what that means is that they are just kind of from the same family, and so you can use a similar methodology for pruning both of them. Now, you can't use the same methodology for pruning cherries and what are called stone fruits. Those are the fruits that have a hard pit in the middle. But for pome fruits, which are those fruits with the seeds in them, you can actually use the same methodology that we'll go through today. And so we're going to look a little bit about that. And then also we're going to look at the time of year. So right now it's springtime, or just approaching springtime. So the trees are still in dormancy, but we're starting to get some a little bit warmer weather. And you generally want to prune about 2 weeks at least before your trees start to bud out and start to get leaves and that kind of thing. And then we're also going to be looking at some different pruning cuts and just best practices for pruning. So the first set of tools is these pass-through shears, and I really like these shears. They're what I use for most of my small branch removal. The nice thing about them is you can make nice angled cuts, and these guys are pretty sharp and they're good steel, so I really like to use these for most of what I do when I'm pruning the smaller branches out. The alternative to those guys is these single blade shears, and these are nice when you're trying to get a cut that's perpendicular to the stick. So if your stick is running like this, it allows you to get a flat cut without much tear out at the end, and that essentially reduces disease. But for most of my cuts, for most of my pruning cuts, I'm making angled cuts, and so I like to use these pass-through shears just because they allow you to make those angled cuts, which these don't do so well on the angled cuts. When I'm moving into bigger material, I'll use these larger loppers, and these are good. They give you a little more mechanical advantage, and it's just important to keep these guys sharp, but they do a really good job, especially when you're getting into some bigger material. You definitely don't want to be trying to use these smaller shears just because it's hard and you usually don't get a good cut on them. Then I also carry with me some isopropyl alcohol and a rag, and this is just because whenever you're pruning between multiple trees, or even between the same trees when it has diseased wood, you always want to clean your shears out to make sure that you're not carrying any disease from one tree to the other. And so that's really important to keep with you, this alcohol and a little rag just to wipe things off and keep everything clean, just like you're doing an operation. We'll look at this particular pear tree, and again, these pruning principles work across both pears and apples because they're both pome fruits. But this guy, it's about 4 years old, and he's been here for just about a year. I didn't get to prune him last year, so he doesn't have a great structure, but we'll get into kind of the philosophies I'm gonna incorporate in this pruning, and the first things you want to look at, and the first thing that you do want to look at, or at least keep in mind when you're pruning, is the 30% rule. And what that means is each year you only want to take, or you want to take no more than 30% of the tree. You don't want to prune any more than 30% of the tree, and that's because when you prune a tree, it puts a tree into a little bit of a survival mode. And so essentially it does a lot of leafy growth and not so much of the fruiting that you want for the fruit, obviously. And so you never want to take really more than 30% of the tree, and if you can take less, that's great, but you do want to keep your tree in a good structure and healthy. So before you make your cuts for the structure of the tree, you first want to look at what's called the 3 Ds, and those are kind of 3 rules of thumb of the things you want to take away from the tree first, and that is wood that is dead, wood that is diseased, and wood that is damaged. And damaged could mean that it got hit by a tractor, the side of a tractor, or could be that there's such a snow load that it breaks a branch, whatever that be. But you want to look at those things first, and you want to remove that wood first because that's what's going to spread disease to the tree, and it'll really make for a really unhealthy tree, and it could actually kill your tree. So you really want to avoid that kind of wood, and by pruning it out first, you kind of get that out of the way. But you want to keep that in mind because that is part of your 30% that you're taking out. So you want to not take too much. Now, as far as the actual structure of the tree, what you're looking at is when you're doing a pear or an apple, you want what's called a central leader. And what that means is that you have one trunk, and then essentially you have a couple different scaffolds of branches at about 3-foot intervals. And the first one you usually start at about 36 to 40 inches. That determination is mostly on the height of your mowing deck, and essentially how easy do you want it to be able to get under the tree, to mow it, and how high do you want the branches to have to pick fruit off of them. So it's not a number that's concrete or set in stone. You can change it a little bit, but you do want about 3 feet in between, 3 to 4 feet in between your scaffolds. Another thing before you really start getting into the structure of the tree is you want to look at two things on the tree that you want to remove, and that's these guys. These guys, I don't know if you guys can see, but they actually go down to the base of the tree, and these are what you call suckers. And essentially they grow from the roots, and they don't produce much fruit. They take away from the central leader structure of the tree, and they sometimes they actually won't even be the type of fruit that you want because they'll be from the rootstock, and we can get into rootstocks on a different video, but they're really just not good for the tree, and so you want to take those out before you even look at the structure. And the other thing that you want to take out, and it's really best to take these out during the summer months when they first start growing, but that's called water sprouts. And this guy actually doesn't have many water sprouts, but essentially what they are is when you have a lateral branch coming this way, you'll have a sprout, and this actually isn't one, this is a fruiting branch, but you'll actually have a branch that goes straight up in the air against the lateral branch, and what that does is it just doesn't fruit very much, and it saps a lot of nutrients from the tree, and it's not a very strong connection, so you'll end up with a lot of those branches breaking in the long term. And so it's best to remove them when they're small, and so they don't cut much into that 30% rule again, because you want to save that for if you have to make structural changes to the tree. So going on with a little bit with the structure, a big thing with apple trees is you're almost farming for light, or you're pruning for light. And a lot of orchardists will say that they're farming for light instead of apples. And really what that means is you're trying to get light that's evenly dispersed throughout the different scaffolds in the tree. And because what that light is going to do is it's going to allow your apples to reach the full sugar levels that they need. And it's also going to allow your apples to grow as much as they need, and allow your leaves to get the proper sunlight to feed those apples. And it'll make the apples look a lot better. They'll just have a better skin coloration, and all around a better apple. So you want to try to maximize the amount of sunlight that you can get to your apples and to your leaves as well at each different level of the tree. And so when you're pruning in the central leader, really what you're thinking about is you want a pyramid structure of your tree. And so you want it obviously thinnest at the top, and bulkiest at the bottom, with your lateral branches going the furthest, and that'll be the best dispersion of sunlight within this tree. But let's get into a little bit of the pruning cuts we make and kind of how I'm going to tackle this tree particularly. Okay, so we took a look at this tree. It didn't look like any of the 3Ds were present, so there was no dead, diseased, or damaged wood, which is great. It's great to have a healthy tree like that. And so the next thing we did is we went ahead and took out the sucker sprouts that were coming up, and there were no really water sprouts in this tree, so we didn't have to worry about that too much. But the next thing I want to look at is really the structure of the tree, and trying to get good light and airflow within the tree. So the first thing I'm going to take out is these guys down here. These guys are a little bit below where I'd like the scaffolding of the first branches of scaffolding to come. I'd like them to be a little bit higher up here and not so low. This is probably 1.5 feet above the soil level, so it's not quite at that 30-inch level. This is a little bit above that 30-inch, but I'm happier with having it higher rather than lower. So I'll go ahead and take these guys out. And then also, that's going to get me closer to my 30% rule, because this is a small tree. So I'm going to take this branch up here out, because he has what we call a really bad crotch angle. And the crotch angle is the angle from the vertical stem that you have your branch coming off. It's the angle from vertical. And generally, for a strong branch and a branch that'll produce a lot of fruit, you want to have between a 75 and 45 degree angle, maybe a little bit lower, but generally you want about that angle, and that'll produce a branch which, if they're more lateral, they generally have more fruit on them. And also, if they are more lateral, not completely flat, but if they're more lateral, then they'll have a lot better structure as far as when they get fruit on them. They won't break under either snow load or under fruit load, particularly when this tree gets bigger, because you want to be thinking ahead in the future. I want a strong tree. I want a tree that's going to last a long time. And so how do I manage for that? Is I have good crotch angles. And also, this guy competes with the central leader, because he has such a steep crotch angle, and he's towards the higher scaffold of the tree. he does compete with that central leader, and so I want just the central leader to be going up, and I don't want anything to be competing with it. I want all my other branches to be kind of focused on fruiting rather than growing in height. So that'll be kind of why I take this guy out. And then so another thing is looking at the scaffolding of this tree. You want all your branches to not be crossing over with each other. So like these two branches are, well, I won't be taking this guy out, but these two branches right now are crossing over, and that's not good, is because essentially it hurts your light because one branch will shade out another branch, and it also just hurts your airflow. And when you have low airflow, you get a lot of disease, you get a lot of fungus and bacteria, especially on the wet days in the spring and summer. And so you want to try to minimize the amount of crossover you have between your branches, and you want generally your lower branches to be a little bit longer as far as laterally, and you want them to, because I think when you have that pyramid shape, they can branch out and they can find that sunlight. But you also want to have that's also why you want to have the distance between your scaffolds, because it allows you to get that good airflow and the sunlight dispersion within the tree throughout the day. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the cuts that we're going to do on these trees, and the two different types of cuts and what we're looking for to do with each of those cuts. So when removing these lower scaffolding branches that we want to take away from the tree, we're going to use what's called a thinning cut. And a thinning cut is when you want to remove material from the tree and you don't want much regrowth. You just want that branch to be taken off of the central leader. And essentially how you do a thinning cut is you're just cutting at a little bit of an angle, really close to the central leader. But you don't want to cut it too close. See, there's a little bit of a mound right here of wood that is essentially what is going to heal the tree once you make that cut. And so you don't want to cut into this little raised area right here. You want to go a little bit, maybe a quarter of an inch up on the branch before you make that cut. And you also want to angle your cut a little bit so that you have good shedding of water, so you don't get water buildup there, and it makes for a lot healthier tree. So let's go ahead and make that cut. It's like, well, wrong pair of loppers. And we'll go ahead and remove the rest of these guys as well. And those are our thinning cuts. So next we're going to remove this scaffolding branch, as I talked about, and we just don't want it to be competing with the central leader. We want to open up a little bit of sunlight, and we don't like that bad crotch angle. So let's go ahead and give this guy a cut. We'll go ahead and remove some of these smaller branches because they will be crossing over once they start to get a little bit bigger. And they're not in a great position as far as the scaffolding I'd like to have. So go ahead and remove them. And that basically gives us the structure of the tree that we want. Okay, so next I'm going to make what's called a heading cut. This is a cut that we want to use to promote growth. And essentially you're cutting back the tip of the tree, which is where the tip of the branch, which is where the growth inhibitor hormone is, and then that allows the tree to have the full amount of energy and the full amount of growth hormone go to it. And it allows this branch will really explode. And since I don't have many branches in this area, I'd like this part of the tree to expand a little bit more. So I'm going to go ahead and make that cut. You want to go for about a quarter inch from the bud that you want to grow into the branch that you'd like. And so essentially you're again making an angled cut to shed some water about a quarter inch above, because any lower and it'll dry out the bud here. And then that should grow into a branch, which will hopefully produce some fruit soon. So a quick recap today for hitting the essentials of what we covered. The first thing is you're on your weather. You want to look for a day when you have a good forecast coming up. You don't want huge temperature swings, and you don't want really cold days in the 10, 20, or even 0 degree days, in that kind of range. You want to try to stick away from that if you can. Also, remember that when you first start pruning, you want to keep in mind the 30% rule. You don't want to remove more than 30% of a tree each year, or you'll get a huge amount of growth that you don't want, even when you're pruning trees that have been not pruned for a while or mismanaged. You still want to keep that rule of thumb in mind. Also, remember that for the structure of your tree, before you get to the structure, you want to do the 3 Ds, which is dead, diseased, and damaged wood. You want to remove those first. And then you want to look at the structure of your tree, and you want to look at scaffolding on pears and apples about every 3 feet, and starting between 30 and 48 inches above the ground, usually closer to the 30 mark, but that's a fluid number based upon your preference essentially. Then the other thing is, when you're looking at structure, you want to maintain a good structure that doesn't have much crossing over of your branches, and that just helps for sunlight and for airflow. And you also want to maintain good crotch angles between hopefully 50 and 75 degrees, 45, somewhere in that range. And that just gives you a good fruiting branches, and it also gives you some really strong branches that can hold a lot of fruit and hold a lot of snow depending on where you are. And then just remember your cuts, your thinning cuts, don't go too close to the tree on those. And then also your heading cuts, that's you're trying to promote growth. Remember that the tree will grow where you make your cut on the next couple buds down. And so, make those heading cuts strategically, and where you want the tree to grow and where the tree can grow that it isn't utilizing the sunlight within its area. And that's kind of the big things for today. So if you have any questions, then let us know in the comments. If you guys like to see other videos like how to restore an old tree that hasn't been pruned, how to prune a tree from a whip, a first year sapling tree, if you'd like to know how to graft, any questions you guys have on trees, there's a lot of knowledge out there, and a lot of knowledge that we'd love to share with you guys. So let us know what you think, and let us know any other questions you have and problems you're running into, and we hopefully get a video out to you guys on that.